Hey folks, welcome back, and this is part 5 of Domain 1, where we're going to talk about policy, standards, procedures, and guidelines. And we covered a little bit about this earlier on in this domain, but just to dive a little bit deeper into policy, security policy is the highest level of documentation. So this is, as I mentioned before, this is the top of in terms of what the organization is supposed to do. It's intended to be an overview of the organization's approach to security practices and solutions. And it should define the strategic objective, the vision, the goals, and the frameworks. Now, again, it's supposed to talk about the what. It's not supposed to talk about the how, how something is supposed to be done. It's just supposed to say, here is what should be done. It assigns responsibilities. It defines roles, specifies audit requirements, enforcement processes, compliance requirements, and acceptable risk levels. An example of a security policy, and we're probably all familiar with these for any of us that work in the corporate environment, but an acceptable use policy, a data breach policy, remote access policy, and access control policies are all examples of policies. Now, I mentioned before, there's encryption policies. There's a lot of other different types of policies that exist. But again, the goal here is to create a security policy that the organization needs to follow. And then the other documents that align to that policy are all part of that overall hierarchy. And so those other documents we're going to talk about here are the standards. And this is what spells out how the technology can be uniformly implemented inside of an organization. As I mentioned before, the standard is going to be more specific. It's going to talk about very detailed, a requirement that the hardware, the software is supposed to use to implement that security control. And then a baseline is going to be a minimum set of security that a system in an organization must adhere to. So these are a little bit more detailed than standards, and it's more focused around the operation. So you can think of things like golden images or basic or standard security configuration that must be applied to certain software or certain hardware when it comes into the organization. And then guidelines are going to provide a recommendation of a standard or a baseline. So again, these aren't required, but they're more guides for not just security professionals, but also users. And it's going to give some steps on how to implement a baseline or a standard. And then the last one here is going to be the security procedure. And often it's called a standard operating procedure or an SOP. And these are used to provide that step-by-step set of instructions in order to perform a certain task. So what does this look like, from a bigger picture here? So you have at the top, as I mentioned before, there's an encryption policy. Then you have a standard that is going to set the algorithm, or it's going to state what the algorithm should be used for asymmetric encryption. The baseline is going to say, here's the version of TLS to be allowed for HTTPS connections, and they need to be, and any web server that gets implemented into the organization must adhere to that minimum version of TLS. And then the guideline is going to show the end user device guidance on protection. And then the procedure is actually going to show installing an external certificate to a web server. Now, again, these are all kind of examples of the different breakdowns of that document hierarchy here. But again, think of the policy at the top. You have the standards that are more detailed and are requirements. You have the baseline, which gives a minimum set of configuration that must be adhered to. The guidelines are going to provide a little bit more information around the standards and the baselines. And then procedures are going to be step by step. With that, I hope you enjoyed this, and I look forward to seeing you again.